All right, hello everyone and welcome to Audubon Chapter of Minneapolis's February program. Thanks for bearing with us as we did a little schedule change on this one. I am Amy Simso-Dean and I am the vice chair of the board at ACM, and I'm pretty excited to be up here. I want to welcome everyone and let you know that we're striving really hard to be a welcome community and that all are welcome here at all of our programs, events when we get to do them, and all of our outings and board meetings. So if you want to get involved with us, I'm just gonna check out. We really invite you to always attend any of our upcoming programs. In March, we have a program coming up on bird genetics and how that leads into diversity of species. Should be really interesting. And in April, we have one on bird advocacy with the American Bird Conservancy, which is a great organization that works across the Americas to protect bird habitats and birds. You are always welcome to join any of our committee meetings. We have an advocacy committee meeting on February 17th. We have our community engagement committee on February 22nd, and our board meeting on February 20. Oh, I'm sorry, community engagement is on the 21st. And the board meeting is on the 22nd, and you can reach out on our website to anyone if you'd like to join any of those and see what we're up to. We had some exciting news today. We had, hold on, I gotta find my little notes there. We won our lawsuit with Smart Growth Minneapolis and Minnesota Citizens for the Protection of Migratory Birds at the Minnesota Supreme Court. We sued the city over their refusal to conduct environmental impact statements as part of the 2040 comprehensive plan. Now, we do want to make sure you know this. We are not against urban diversity at all, but we see it as a way that we don't oppose that diversity, but we believe that safe, affordable housing is a right and can play a role with environmental justice, and these can go together. So there is a blog post about this, and we'll be sending out an email blast with more information. If you have questions, just reach out to us on our website. And that is another way you can get involved. So always jump over to our website to contact us to see what's up with our blog. You can sign up for our newsletter. We have a Facebook page, Audubon Chapter of Minneapolis. We have a YouTube channel, and most of our programs are recorded. So if you miss one, you can go there and find out what's going on. We also have an Instagram, so you can see some of the great photos that some of our board members and members are sending in to us. So make sure I got all of that. And now, just to do a little breaking of the ice with everyone who's there, I'm going to invite anyone who wants to put your answers in the chat and let me know, where are some of your favorite places to enjoy nature? We have some gardeners, I'm sure, that are joining us, and definitely some bird watchers and some people who get to do both. So where are you getting out and enjoying nature, since probably a lot of us aren't getting out there today? And go ahead and put that in the chat and we'll see what's going on. Anna Peterson says she loves Theodore Worth Park. Did you go and see the Iceman that they put in there? I was tempted to go see that. Jean Davids loves Sherburne and her own front yard. I agree with that. We got another Sherburne, Breckwoods in St. Paul. I don't know that place, but that's where Irena, one of our board members, likes to go. Bike trails along the Mississippi from Katie. Duluth and anywhere north of there. I know I'm a big fan of Saxum. St. Croix River Valley. Big Lakes, another Saxum. Whoa, they're going really fast now. We got a few. Oh, someone lives on 120 acres of woods. That's Jody. You are super lucky. Woodrill Natural Wayzata. I haven't heard of that one, so that sounds pretty interesting. Cuyuna, William O'Brien, anywhere in Christine Olson has anywhere in northeastern Minnesota. That's pretty good. Minnesota Valley and Moose Lake, and that's interesting. I haven't been up to Moose Lake in a very long time. Oh, here's someone like me just watching suet, the birds at the suet feeders in the backyard. That's kind of where I am right now. Bayfield and the Apostle Islands. This person lives 1,000 feet from Lake Superior. What an amazing view. Oh, we have a gardener who watches birds and enjoys nature in her gardens. Smoky Mountains and her yard in Crown Point, Indiana. Welcome from Indiana. Here's a very classic response, and I would say this is a big one for me too, is at the cabin, and this person is in Reamer, Minnesota. Point Nay Park in Maple Lake. That's another one I haven't heard from, so maybe that'll be worth checking out. Oh, snowshoeing. I do enjoy snowshoeing. Another gardener here who enjoys her gardens as well as Theodore Worth. I know a fun place to go is the wildflower garden, the Eloise Butler in Theodore Worth, where you can enjoy both the flowers and the birds that are attracted to those flowery landscapes. It's great. Someone likes to go camping in Morrison County. Oh, hello in Oregon. I would like to be in your backyard in Oregon right now, where it sounds like it might be a little warmer than in Minnesota. We're at a whopping 8 degrees today. It was a big warm up. I think we made it to 8. Oh, Wood Lake in Bloomington. That is a great place. That's in Minnesota. Oh, and someone's taunting me with 65 degrees in Georgia. Oh, and the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum and Westwood Hills Nature Center. I hope people are getting some new ideas here as they're going through these. Maybe I'll have to go and type them all up for a blog post. Great places to go, except for you in the warm Georgia. I'm not putting you down. That's not fair. Although my in-laws moved to Georgia and they moved up into the mountains, so they had no winter clothes. So me being from Minnesota, I was set for sending them warm clothes for like 10 years straight. Oh, here's someone who just purchased 2.3 acres in Indiana and wants to plant natives. Well, Tammy, you are in the perfect presentation. That will be great. All right. Well, I want to thank everyone for that. Wow, people got really excited about that question. That's great to see. We like everyone to be involved. So it sounds like that's about wrapping up. I haven't seen a new one in a while. So when we come into our program, which we're going to be starting in a little bit, I want to invite people, if you have a question for our presenter, please use the Q&A function on your Zoom. If you're using a laptop, it's down at the bottom. And what we'll do is we'll just keep an eye on those and we'll be asking those at the end. And that way we can curate a little bit. And if there's questions that kind of go together, we can ask them at the same time. So we're going to ask everyone to mute, have their videos off. And then instead of using chat at that point, please start using the Q&A function so we can track those really easy and make sure to get to as many people as we can. All right. Well, check my notes, make sure I got through everything here. Yep. All right, well, I am gonna jump over to a different screen for me, and I'm gonna introduce our speaker. So Bre Bauerly has been with Minnesota Native Landscapes for 11 years and specializes in assisting homeowners in selecting the right native species for their property. I know I need help with that for sure. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Bre, and we really value and appreciate that you're taking your time to be with us tonight. Thank you.
I'm excited to see what kinds of questions come up. It's always interesting to speak to different groups and get an idea for kind of where people's interests lie and where your backgrounds are. I'm sure everybody has a little bit of varying knowledge in the topics and probably knows a lot more about birds than I do, but hopefully I can teach you something about native plants. So with that, I will start a PowerPoint that I have put together here, and hopefully everything works according to plan. Let's see here. Okay, so when we're talking about native restoration or restoring natives into your backyard or beyond, we're really talking about reintroducing plants that existed here, pre-settlement times. And it's what we do on a large scale, converting land back to more naturally occurring ecosystems. Here in Minnesota, that could be tall grass prairie, short grass prairie, wetlands, woodlands, you name it. Even as far as doing riverbank reconstruction and shorelines and creating rain gardens, some of these newly kind of established BMP type programs are all using native plants, which are beneficial to the surrounding ecosystems. And I'm going to go into some background about how native plants are beneficial to more than just wildlife. And then after that, really get into some of the great wildlife benefits. But I just want to mention that anything that we do as a company on a large scale is something that you can kind of recreate on a scale, either in your own backyard, in your surrounding community. And I'm hoping I can give you some good ideas of ways you could be inspired and get out there and get involved in native restoration. So a little bit more about my background and why I like talking about this. I spent my first 7 years with Minnesota Native Landscapes out in the field doing restoration work. So everything from kind of early successional prairie maintenance to buckthorn removal to planting native plant plugs and hand seeding projects, and a lot of like prescribed burning and all of the different processes that we use in our toolbox of native restoration. And then about 5 years ago, I started doing outreach and kind of developed just joy for helping other people. And so with that, been able to kind of create opportunity for us to help the community kind of with these like DIY type projects. So whether it's somebody looking to do something in their own backyard or just giving some advice and coaching along the way of ways that that you or somebody else can do these projects the correct way. And they're important, right? So we're really used to seeing yards that look like this one in my picture, just a very traditional turf lawn. Mostly it's for aesthetic purposes. We're just, we maintain our lawn because our neighbors do, or just because that's the way that we've always done it. We maintain highly manicured turf for recreational opportunities, mainly like sporting opportunities or school ball fields, different things like that, parkland. And then there's, you know, of course, important things like maintaining lines of sight along roadways. So sometimes that's, you know, important to maintain a certain height of vegetation for safety purposes. But, you know, a lot of it is aesthetic and just because of keeping up with the neighborhood, I guess you could say. And there's certain laws that, you know, that require you to maintain your lawn in such ways. And those are changing here over time in Minnesota, especially, but, you know, lawns in America have taken over a really large portion of our land, you know, second to producing farmland and things like that. But it certainly have taken many acres of formerly prairie type ecosystems here in Minnesota. And then, you know, on top of that, we're maintaining them to such a high standard using things like irrigation and fertilizers that we don't always know how to use correctly. So we're doing things like inappropriate timing for watering, as in like watering in the middle of the day or watering just after rain events, and poor application of things like fertilizers and causing issues like runoff, things like that. So a lot of that, like I mentioned, a lot of it is wasted, and there's just better use of space. So different ways to think about, you know, what we can do in our own backyard. There are two approaches, the evolutionary approach or the revolutionary approach. And evolutionary just kind of is a different way of doing things, right? So switching over maybe to a solar powered lawnmower or a hand powered lawnmower, or setting up an irrigation schedule, or switching to organic fertilizer. And all of these, like, what do they have to do with birds? But really all of these practices can actually benefit our soil and our clean water, and you know, the other tiny neighbors that we don't know, you know, that are there are the insects in our soil. or insects using our lawn space or attempting to use our lawn space, and maybe they'd prefer something a little bit more diverse, but they're there and they are a major food source for our native songbirds. So that's why I'm going on and on about lawn care, but just another, you know, way to consider improving backyard habitat. And then the revolutionary approach to lawn care, like the interseeding with clover or establishing a bee lawn. And I'm going to mention just a few things about bee lawn before I talk about actual native restoration or native landscaping. And then xeriscaping, we don't really have that in Minnesota just because that's more popular in like arid climates where they're not maintaining lawn, but more like rock gardens and things. But so in Minnesota, you know, one thing that has caught on really big in the last just maybe couple of years, especially with the recent Lawns to Legumes grant funding and opportunities, is bee lawns. And they are an awesome opportunity to increase diversity in your backyard while still maintaining like short height vegetation that's used for paths or walkways or play spaces, but giving you an overall decreased maintenance. So you're certainly not spraying weeds out from a bee lawn because you're actually encouraging flowers to grow in your lawn. And these are typically Dutch white clover, creeping thyme, and self-heal, and those are not native to Minnesota, but we do view them as a beneficial like habitat over traditional manicured like Kentucky bluegrass or a single species lawn. And then a typical bee lawn would be seeded with fine fescue blend instead of Kentucky bluegrass. That's just a really low maintenance turf alternative. So it doesn't really have to be mowed very often. In fact, you don't have to mow it at all. But if you want to maintain it to like a lawn type look, people will mow it maybe like once a month or less, and really resilient to drought and different growing conditions. So really cool turf alternative. But back to the flowers. You know, anytime that we're increasing diversity in our, you know, even our lawn ecosystem there, we're increasing the number of visitors, as in the insects that are visiting these plants. And as soon as we can increase the number of insects, we're likely to increase the number of birds and other wildlife that are visiting. So it can just be another way to, you know, not everybody has a lawn that is right for establishing a prairie, but you might have a lawn that's, you know, right for establishing a bee lawn. And they can be really lovely as well. So more getting into native vegetation and the benefits that it can provide. This is going to be a little bit on like a larger landscape scale, but I thought it was worth mentioning, you know, in terms of like, why are we making such a big effort to restore natives back to the landscape on such a scale? You know, here we're talking large prairies, or like I mentioned, things like riverbank reconstruction and shoreline restoration. And some of these practices, you know, it is great for wildlife, but it's also great for some of these other aspects of just like community care, you know, things like erosion control and water quality. So really caring about what's happening with our groundwater and reducing runoff by planting these really deep-rooted native plant species that really help stabilize the soil. They promote healthy soils with diverse like soil microbes and just kind of really cool ecosystem happening underneath the soil. This is a popular poster that maybe you've seen before, but it just is such a great graphic showing the diverse roots of native plants kind of throughout the majority of the poster. But over here on the left side, you see what is Kentucky bluegrass. It's maybe 3 inches above ground height, or, you know, whatever you set your mower deck at, typically 3.5, 4 inches, with the equal amount of root mass below ground. So again, only maybe 3-4 inches of roots compared to something like lead plant that has 15-foot maybe root system, or big blue stem here, 10+ feet root system, and so on. So a lot of people have seen this graphic before, but it is just such a kind of staggering image to show you what's going on below ground, in addition to like those above ground benefits that we're getting from prairie species. This is a scientist from National Geographic that actually welded together two drums, like 55-gallon drums, and grew a compass plant for like 2 growing seasons before cutting it out and getting this just really incredible amount of root mass just within, you know, just a short while. And that's what's going on below soil, you know, in your backyard when you plant these species as well. And just can see how it can do so much for promoting healthy soil. Okay, so maybe more exciting to get into here is the benefits of planting prairie or native plants to create habitat. And largely I'll talk tonight about birds, but you know, it of course provides habitat for our other native wildlife, including like game birds like turkeys and pheasants and things, deer, rabbits, you know, a lot of our woodland creatures and the species that support them. So it's hard to talk about native prairies and things these days without mentioning pollinators, and they are super important in the cycle of promoting songbird habitat here in Minnesota as well. But you know, part of the reason that there's so many efforts to promote pollinators these days is because, you know, of how much we rely on them for our plant reproduction, and how they rely on our diversity of species to provide that food and shelter. So we really, our native plant species and our native pollinators have co-evolved to each other's benefit over time. And you know, what we can do then is promote using diverse plantings, you know, in the backyard, in the city park, in the wider rural communities, and we can, you know, reintroduce these diverse seed mixes and hopefully promote diverse habitat for our pollinators, as well as, you know, the other species that rely on them. There are still challenges, right? So like these challenges are getting less and less every year. The people are learning more about native plants. They're recognizing them. You know, it used to be every city had the long grass or weed laws or ordinances. And so, you know, if you didn't have a fence around your prairie or have a sign that says this is a intentional garden, or if it was not in the backyard of your home, you know, there's all these rules that different communities have for these gardens. So you could be fined unless it's referred to as like a managed natural area. So that's kind of a more modern term that contradicts the long grass or weed laws. And you know, one of the things you can do to get around it is putting a picket fence up or putting a sign up or just educating your neighbors. But really, it's just becoming more and more common knowledge that people are planting these prairies in their yard or in their boulevards, and they are intentional. And there's ways to make them look intentional, but there's also ways to spread the word. You know, if you're going to go with a little bit more of a rustic look or a traditional prairie planting, you know, as long as you're abiding with like boulevard height restrictions and things like that, then there's definitely ways to kind of make it work. And, you know, there used to be more and more where you'd have to apply for a permit or submit a proposal for a planting of a prairie and things like that. But again, as the times are changing, these are becoming more and more common, and, you know, the ordinances are passing, you know, more and more to be accepting of these untraditional gardens. So backyard planting can take so many different forms, right? So you don't have to get rid of all of your turf. If you have children or grandchildren that use the space, then use the space. But you probably have a corner or a pocket somewhere that you can incorporate these really unique native plantings. And so I'd encourage you to think about that in your own backyard. And the great thing about native plants in Minnesota is that we have so many different native ecosystems that have their own plants that are adapted to our conditions here in Minnesota. So you might have shady, moist soil, but that's okay because there's some native species that will thrive there. And you might have a very sandy, sunny, dry soil, and that's great too because there's native species that really thrive in those conditions. So there's some really unique species that we have here in Minnesota and really unique gardening challenges. So we just have to kind of combine the two and pick out what kind of diversity we can from that. So, there's also ways to benefit yourself with a native planting as far as, in this case, turf lawn was removed. So this homeowner did not have to mow the hillside anymore. And a shady hillside is just like a great way to have a problem growing nice manicured turf anyway. It's just kind of a challenge to begin with. So rather than battling that and taking on the danger of mowing up and down a hill every week, why not turn it into a native garden? You could also go all in and convert your entire yard into a beautiful, diverse native prairie. It requires some level of maintenance, but the maintenance is very different than that of mowed 2.5 acres of turf grass. Instead of sitting on the lawnmower, you get to kind of wander these prairies and pull a thistle here or there, or see what you can see. But there are some really just unique opportunities here in Minnesota to incorporate natives into any scale yard. And I encourage anybody to think about different types of yards that you see and how they could be enhanced. Whether it's a shoreline up at the cabin that was previously being mowed all the way to the lake shore, or maybe it's talking to your watershed district about putting a rain garden in because you have a wet spot in the side of your yard where you're collecting a lot of runoff. There's just more and more opportunities to do these things, sometimes with cost share assistance and certainly with more opportunity to find really cool, unique native plants. I think we're really lucky here in Minnesota to have some great native plant sales that hopefully we'll be able to host again in the near future, but regardless, have some really great native plant vendors, and I'm going to show some resources here in a second for selecting native plants. So one thing that we did at Minnesota Native Landscapes, and I should back up a little bit because we do a lot of projects, right, of small scale, large scale. And I touched on kind of some of the different kinds of projects we do, but we also grow our own native plants and seed across just about 400 acres and over 200 species between seed and plants, or a little bit over that. And then we look at what's going on kind of in the world, and this is one of our newer seed mixes. We've had this mix out maybe 4 or 5 years now, and we created it based off of recommendations from the Audubon Society, and I'm going to show you the webpage here in a second, just so you can see some of the features if you haven't yet taken the opportunity. But, you know, one of the things that we look at when we're designing seed mixes is bloom time, looking at increasing diversity on the landscape. So in this species in particular, we have, or in this mix in particular, we have 22 flowering species, and then 6 grasses and a sedge. And this is kind of designed to look good in a backyard. It's got mostly short grass component to it. And then some really great wildflowers, but more importantly than how we think it looks is how the, you know, wildlife around us views it. And so what we did was take the recommendations of species from the Audubon website and compile different bloom seasons as well as different resources. So, you know, on top of birds visiting our native plants to collect seed, especially with the grasses, you know, they're gonna land on the grass in the wintertime, use that as a seed resource. But in the growing season, we have so many bird species that visit our prairies seeking out insects. So we have bluebirds that, you know, they're seeking grasshoppers and crickets and moths. Moths are pollinators. So, I mean, you have a pollinator prairie, you're going to attract bluebirds that are seeking out moths or the larvae to consume. Cardinals are visiting, eating beetles and leafhoppers and stink bugs, and chickadees will eat aphids off of milkweeds and caterpillars and ants. And grosbeaks are, you know, visiting to eat caterpillars and other insects. But then we have, you know, other native birds like finches. We're going to find finches anywhere that we have blazing star growing, among other native species. But, you know, we know if we incorporate these species into our mixes, that we're going to attract not only the pollinator insects that are going to visit these plants throughout the growing season, but also the native bird species that, that rely on those insects. So let's click over to the Audubon website for a minute so I can show you how that works. So this is the homepage here. If you just type in audubon.org, this is what it's going to bring you to. And I'm sure there's different ways to find the native plant finder, but I often just will Google search Audubon native plant finder. But from the homepage, you can also go to how to help and click, and then scroll down to the bottom here and you'll see plant native plants.
Bre?
Yep.
I think you need to share.
Oh, you can't see my screen. Okay.
Screen. Yeah, I think we're still looking at the presentation, and I know that they'll be interested in how you're navigating that webpage.
Okay, here we go. Can you see it now?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, let me know if it doesn't. Just shout at me next time because I'll do it again, I'm sure. Okay, so from the homepage again, this is the homepage right now, and the pictures will change, but right now this is what it looks like. Click how to help, and then if you scroll down to the bottom, plant native plants. And from there, you're gonna go to the native plant database. And here it's gonna ask for your email address and your zip code. And the zip code is important because it's going to personalize your experience. It's gonna suggest native plants that are local to your region. So I'm in central Minnesota. I put in my zip code and I'm gonna click search. And now it's gonna populate a list. There's a few different ways to kind of navigate this list based on what you're looking for. And I'll show you just, you know, based off of some of the things I've talked about, the different types of plants, but there's, you know, categories for best results and full results. And another cool thing is local resources. So here in Minnesota, like I mentioned, we have a lot of great vendors for native plants. And so we're listed here under nurseries. So these are places that you can call around and try to find certain plants if you're looking for them, or they may be able to provide some great information. So away from there though, we'll go back to the results, and I'll go to full results here. And then what I'm going to do is filter it a little bit just to show you what it looks like. So I'm going to filter by annuals and perennials. That's going to give us our herbaceous species and grasses. So this is kind of what you might see if you were to look at a native plant list. It's not looking like I wanted to. Maybe I need to go. Okay, here we go. So you can also filter and feel free to visit this page and kind of look around, but so I'm gonna go back to my filters here, annuals and perennials and grasses. But you can check out, nectar plants, that's gonna, attract hummingbirds. But you can also look at fruit-bearing plants and so on. So maybe you want to attract butterflies. So certainly click on that and see what you can find. I will say typically like the most amount of diversity that you plant will attract the most amount of diversity in return. But there are certainly like generalist prairie species that attract a wide variety of different types of plants and, or not plants, of insects and birds and other wildlife. So a lot of those will be the kind of typical prairie plants that you see on most lists. But anyway, this list now will show some great recommendation of different native plants. You can add them to a list. It gives you a lot of great information about them. Even something like this, which is really important here in Minnesota, it's resistant to browsing by deer. With native plants, they actually are often resistant to deer browse in maturity because the hairs on the leaves and the hairs on the stems are not really all that palatable. So there's a great thing about native plants. If you have a lot of deer and rabbit pressure, there are some native plants that you might be able to try. So anyway, on top of all the great information, it also will give you a list of birds that you might be able to attract to your property by planting these species. So that's really cool. If you have some favorites, you can certainly try to narrow down your list based on that. And you can do that here in the search as well. So it's just a really, really handy tool that you can use to kind of create your own list. Let's see here, I'll go back to my PowerPoint now. Okay, so back to my list here. And a lot of times when creating a seed mix or just a diverse recommendation of planting list, I usually would say to incorporate as many different bloom seasons as you can. So this has maybe a little bit better picture. Typically, we'd want to recommend at least 3 spring, summer, and fall blooming plants. Now, spring in Minnesota, spring blooming species are kind of one of the harder to find for natives. But there are certainly plenty of them out there. They're just not necessarily in this particular seed mix. A lot of times, the later you get into the growing season, you have just the resources change. In the springtime, there are a ton of native trees and shrubs that are fruiting and blooming. And so you may have a lot more bird visitors if you're thinking along those lines. If you in your own backyard don't have capacity for planting natives, maybe if you're in a building or a townhouse or something like that, there are definitely ways to get involved in the community with planting different like BMPs, like rain gardens or parking lot islands and things like that. So I kind of never stop looking for opportunities for different native planting areas. And this top one here is a rain garden at it's a small zoo in central Minnesota, the Freeport Zoo or Hemker Zoo in Freeport. And this was just a kind of a wet, weird spot in the lawn that always flooded, and they worked with their local Watershed district to put in this really beautiful rain garden. And in the more zoomed out photo, there's a giraffe that's over here kind of like gazing at the rain garden, which is kind of funny. But this lower picture on the lower right corner is from the Maplewood Mall. And if you ever notice at the Maplewood Mall, there's over 200 rain gardens in the parking lot. And those are doing a great job of filtering groundwater and introducing, you know, more deep-rooted native species. And there's also a ton of trees, native trees planted in the parking lots as well. So just a really great project to kind of get away from more traditional landscaping and providing a lot more benefits to the community. And a lot of people have shady backyards, and so maybe looking at prairie plants isn't right for you. And the Audubon plant list that I showed a minute ago is great for kind of more basic lists and providing a ton of information. But there are other resources in Minnesota to find different types of plants based on different conditions. And shady backyards is one of like the most common questions that I get. You know, what kinds of native plants are there for shady backyards? And there actually are quite a few, and they are great for wildlife. They're not maybe as showy as some of those main like well-known prairie plants like a black-eyed Susan or a purple coneflower, but they are really unique in their own way. So they definitely have some great benefits. But in this particular picture, we're looking at kind of a bigger problem in Minnesota backyards, the invaded buckthorn understory. And so this isn't providing a lot of great wildlife benefits at all. Birds will eat buckthorn berries, but birds would prefer a more diverse diet and a more diverse offering, and so would, you know, all the other wildlife. So enhancing with native understory, it's a big task, right? So removing buckthorn and restoring the woodland understory, it is a big project, but it is also very worth it. You know, you're able to reclaim your usable space. You're gonna be able to enjoy what you're seeing in the understory, and hopefully that is a lot more diversity of wildlife as well as plant life. Here's just a few of my favorite recommendation for woodland planting. You know, we don't have black-eyed Susans that thrive in the woodland, but we do have the brown-eyed Susan. It's quite a bit taller, but it also has a lot more blooms per plant. It does pretty well in kind of like a medium, light to medium shade, maybe not in like a full dense shade, but the anise hyssop, largely the aster, wild columbine, there are some great native flowering species that are well adapted to the woodland. And some of these are great, like columbine is a great hummingbird plant, and hyssop as well, anything with those kind of tube-shaped flowers. So then even on the smaller scale, you know, putting in prairies or restoring, you know, your backyard and doing some of those improvements that I showed in previous slides, where you're actually taking a chunk out of your backyard and converting it over to prairie, that can be kind of a big project to start with, especially to a new gardener or somebody with a, you know, a more traditional lawn space, and maybe it's only a few thousand square feet. So recently we put together kind of this concept for a pocket prairie that wasn't just like a list of plants that you could put together, but we really wanted it to be a full, like a kit, a start to finish kit that, you know, anybody could do. And I think I'm going to show you just a video, because I think I actually have two videos, but they're short. This one is just kind of like, I really like it. I think it's a little bit inspiring about like reintroducing natives into your backyard, and that you can do it on a small scale. And this is particular about the My Pocket Prairie, but you can do this yourself with just selecting some native plants. So my pocket prairie concept is kind of unique in saying like anybody can and should have a prairie in their yard, no matter what size or scale, but it's not totally unique in the concept of, you know, putting prairies into urban ecosystems. We have, you know, initiatives like blooming boulevards and alleys and some of these conversions that are already taking place. But in this particular kit, it just kind of, like, for example, comes with like all of these little pieces to do that, which I think is unique. And I'm not going to play this whole video, but it's just an accessible way to put a prairie into any yard, you know, right over the turf grass and go from there. But you can take this same concept and put it into your community, you know, existing perennial beds. How often do you go to the garden center and pick out a 1 gallon daylily, or maybe you plant a new variety of a rose bush, but maybe consider a native shrub rose instead, or you know, put in some diverse bloom times of native species, you know, into your existing perennial bed. Dot a few in here and there, see how you like it before you convert, you know, a large corner of your yard space. But I do, you know, invite you to explore like the different types of native plants that we have here in Minnesota, because, you know, if you have a space under some spruce trees or pine trees that is just maybe a mulch bed, or maybe it's just pine mulch, and you can see your neighbor's backyard, I mean, there's probably going to be some native plants that you could put in there that would be very happy to be there, and you could be providing some wildlife benefits as well. So beyond your own backyard though, and when I did put in the, you know, about planter pots, natives are okay in pots, especially the really large pots, you know, because they're deep rooted, they provide like more benefits in the ground. But you could overwinter little blue stem and sky blue aster and things like that. They don't always look the showiest in a pot, but if you want to put native plants in your yard and planter pots are your option, you could kind of come up with a fun combination of different plants that would bloom throughout the growing season, maybe 4 or 6 different plants or something, but you could do it. But beyond that, you know, if you don't have your own yard space, certainly you visit a library or a corporate campus that maybe has half an acre or more of unused turf space. Maybe you get a conversation started about doing a pollinator prairie conversion. Typically, you know, with a pollinator prairie, and the reason that maybe they get more recognition than a songbird seed mix or a songbird plant kit is that diversity of bloom times, right? So it's nice to pitch a native planting that's blooming May through September or October, you know, over traditional unused turf. You have a lot of benefits to the community as far as aesthetics, and then there's conversations that arise when talking about introducing pollinators to public spaces, but there's a lot of resources out there for that kind of education. But, you know, if you visit a park in your city and it's a lot of unused turf grass that's being maintained as turf grass, you know, there's maybe a conversation to be had about converting some of that back to native prairie with walking trails in between and things like that. So just definitely other options out there in the community as well as in the backyard, in the front yard, and beyond. The native plants can be really easy to care for in the long run. They don't require fertilizer or regular mowings and things like that. It's, you know, very similar to weeding a established garden space. Once you kind of have filled in and eradicated your initial weed source, they're not not requiring a lot of effort. A weed whip is a really great tool for maintaining a native planting. And it's definitely doable on a small scale up to a fairly large scale if you're willing to take on a bit of a project. I think we can move to questions if anybody wants to add any to the Q&A.
All right, thank you so much, Bre. That was great. And we do have a couple of questions here. Let me go ahead and bring them up, and I can read them off to you. And again, I'll apologize on the front end if my cockatoo chimes in behind me. I gave her some cookies, so hopefully we'll keep her placated. All right, so earlier in the program, this question popped up that do long roots of the plants interfere with underground utilities in yards? And should this play into placement of the plants?
That is a great question. And, one of my favorite planting spaces I didn't even mention is septic mounds, because, a lot of times those are newly excavated areas or maybe something that's being mowed as turf grass. But native plants are largely, they largely have a fibrous root system. They can have tap roots as well, but they're typically non-damaging. So you can plant them right up against the foundation of your home, and you can plant them around existing utilities. The caution comes in, word of caution with planting live plant plugs or planting trees or shrubs. Of course, do utility locates first, but if you're seeding a native planting area, it's perfectly safe to do so where you may have utilities existing. The roots are typically just, we call them like non-damaging fibrous systems, and unlike tree roots that are maybe gonna try to interfere with like your sidewalk space or your foundation or things like that. We don't really have that issue with the majority of native plant species. You can sometimes see things like milkweed popping up where you have weak spots, but I mean that's actually more of like a rhizomatous issue than it is any sort of root type issue.
Great. So the next question is about control of an invasive. So this person is asking for any recommendations that you have on controlling the invasive Oriental Bittersweet, but an approach that would avoid using herbicides.
So, yeah, so Oriental Bittersweet is a invasive vine, like a woody vine species, and it's aggressive, as many of our invasive woody species are. It's then with woody or herbaceous perennial invasives, we're really just looking to tax the root system. So it's a repeated cutting. You could try girdling without herbicide, but just girdling by removing that cork cambium layer around the outside in a wide band, as wide as you can. You can do that with like a chainsaw, but not cutting the plant all the way. Or you can cut it again the next growing season, and keep it vigilant. It's not something to start and then walk away from, and that's the same with buckthorn and that sort of different control methods. There's like the buckthorn baggies, and you could try that on a bittersweet root, but I don't know if that would work. I've never tried that. You could try cutting it and then using a weed torch to burn the stump and see if you can limit resprouts that way. You could use a weed torch on the resprouts and see if you can damage them that way. It's really looking to eliminate the resources to the root system to tire the roots out and try to limit that perennial growth coming from them.
Great. The next is on kind of the approach to establishing natives, just in a general sense. So the person is asking, do most people approach this with beginning strictly with seed or actual plants like the plugs, established plants, or doing a combo?
So it really does depend on a few different factors, and one is the size of the planting area, and two is budget, and they kind of go together. So you could obviously definitely do a combination. With a combination of seed and plants, you're going to be able to cover a large area with that seed mix, but also enhance your first couple of growing seasons with that live plant material that you've added. So you'll have more immediate gratification with some of those earlier blooms. And you're gonna have that really long lasting perennial cover with the native seeds that you're able to spread over a wider area. So like our plant kits of 36 native plants, that we just recommend maybe covering 50 square feet or so with like a 15-inch on center spacing. And so with a seed mix, you could easily cover 500 to 1,000 square feet for the same amount of budget. So that's a consideration, as well as, what you're starting with. If you're starting with an existing garden space that was already a mulch bed, or maybe you're starting by one of, several different recommended site preparation techniques, and depending on what you're doing there and what you're starting with, if you're converting turf or if you're converting a weed bed or whatever, then if you're starting with bare soil, you could consider seeding. But if you're starting with something like a compost and cardboard and some of these smothering techniques, you may consider starting with native plants plugged into those practices, or something like a smothering turf lawn with paper grocery bags or recycled newspaper, and then laying down wood mulch on top of that, letting it sit for a couple of weeks, and then planting live plant plugs into that. There's so many different opportunities, but it just depends on your site preparation, and your existing site condition. If you're worried about weed pressure, and you think that maybe putting down a barrier like a newspaper or something, and then wood mulch, just like a bag of mulch or just traditional mulch, then you can plant native plant plugs right into that. But if you're thinking on a larger scale, doing something like digging up the turf or sod cutting or tilling, something to get rid of that turf lawn, seeding is going to be a pretty economical option for converting that.
Thank you. Another attendee had compliments, said that the program was wonderful, and wanted to know if there were resources for planting native rain gardens. So perhaps you could touch on both resources for examples of kind of how to get started kits, informative, and what the steps are, but also any resources that you might be aware of, or examples of resources that provide community members with funding opportunities. I know there are programs sometimes on a county or even a municipal level that support that effort.
Yeah, so I almost always recommend, if you're rural, reach out to your soil and water conservation district. If you live a little bit more in a suburban area, then consider checking to see if you live in a watershed district. And sometimes just Google searching it is good. You can put in the name of your county into your search and put, if you live in Ramsey County, you could put in Ramsey Watershed District, and you're going to find Ramsey Washington Metro Watershed District. And then a lot of times the watershed districts have a map on their website, a map feature that says, do I live in the district? And you can put in your address and find out. And that is a great resource for technical and funding assistance. There was the Lonsdale Games grant. I can only hope that that there's more of those to come in the future. It was such an opportunity for Minnesotans to learn a little bit more about native plants through some of the workshops, and to get involved in planting them in their own yard with the different components, which are all beneficial to birds as well. You know, the native trees and shrubs was one of the options, bee lawns, as I just touched on briefly before, or native plants. And anytime you're planting diverse native plants for pollinators, that's great for birds as well. So any of those categories, it was just such a great opportunity. And so hopefully in the future, we're gonna have more of those sorts of funding opportunities. But I think that on a homeowner level, reaching out to your local resources to start is great. And then watching for some of those initiatives to come up is a good opportunity as well. And attending different native plant sales. So again, when we can do that safely in the future here, when you attend those, or just Google search one and see if there's one near you, they often have tables with resources, different groups, different like conservation groups, as well as possible opportunities for funding partners, often in attendance. So that's a good resource as well.
Thank you. Next question is, how do you prepare soil for native plantings as you do for any flower bed, or what are the considerations that you would need to kind of take in when approaching that?
Yeah, I'm glad somebody asked that, because it is a great opportunity to mention that native plants are really great at adapting to our growing conditions here in Minnesota. So I almost never recommend soil amendments. I don't want you to fertilize after you sprinkle out your native seeds, because you're just going to encourage more weeds to grow. So if you have like sandy soil that nothing else likes to grow in, that is just going to be perfect for blue grama grass and purple prairie clover and pastflower and maybe rough blazing star. Our native plant species are adapted to our local conditions. So if you have very dry, sandy soil, we have natives that like very dry, sandy soil. If you have clay soils that hold moisture after rain for 24 hours, there are natives that like those kind of medium moisture soils. And so rather than amending the soil to fit the plants, we should just select plants that that grow in your soil type. And there are some, luckily.
Next question, let's see. It says, where do you start when you have a plot of weeds / non-natives and want to plant native plants? The person says, my space is about 100 feet by 50 feet. So where do I start?
I always recommend, even if you think you're gonna save up for a year, or you're not ready to do it yet, or it's a big project and you need to learn more about it, in the meantime, just keep the weeds from flowering. A lot of the weeds that are coming up are likely to be annual species that are filling in open space, but they may also be some of the problematic perennial species, and eventually you'll figure out if they are something like a Canada thistle or like leafy spurge or something that you really don't want to have on your property. And those are going to be a little bit more difficult to get rid of, and they may take quite a bit of time. But one thing you can do is just try by cutting them back, preventing them from flowering, maybe removing the flowering material by raking or bagging or having it burned or something like that. And then seeding a diverse native seed mix. And then you may have to pay attention to a little bit more of the maintenance ahead of time. But I think we're learning as we go here over the last few years that introducing native species to outcompete perennial invasives is a worthwhile endeavor. So yes, it's important to have good site preparation, but it's also important to get those seeds in the ground and and let the natives start doing what they are adapted to do. And some of it starts at a soil level. So sometimes we have really bad soils that are really nutrient rich, and we need to approach that a little bit differently. But if you can start removing some of the biomass and as you're planning, and then get started with a good diverse native seed mix, that you should have a good head start.
Thank you. The next is focused on shade areas. So this attendee says, I don't hear folks using seeds in shaded areas. Does Minnesota Native Landscapes have a seed mix for shaded areas specifically, or a plant list?
Yes, so there are some great native seed species. The reason you might not hear about them as often is that they are a little bit harder to grow, and that also makes them a little bit more expensive. But if you're taking on a project, starting at 1,000 square feet or something, then it's a much more economical endeavor. When you're looking at a per acre price on a native woodland seed mix, the number is a little bit staggering at first, but they are harder to grow species, and but they are there, and there's some good diversity to them. And yes, we do have a woodland seed mix. We have savanna seed mix. We have what we call a buckthorn replacement seed mix, which is a lower diversity grass only mix for establishing native cover while you're actively managing buckthorn reef sprouts. But then we do have shade garden kits as well. So like shady plant kits where you can start with live plants. And that's a good way to get started too, especially if you have just some open space in a existing like woodland or shaded mulch bed or garden space.
Great. Looks like we have 5 more questions. Are you game for the 5?
Yep, I think I can do that.
Okay, we can kind of see how in-depth they are. So there is a question about creeping Charlie. And they are asking, would cardboard or a smothering process work on creeping Charlie? And I know that this is a plague for a lot of people around the cities here.
Yeah, it is. It's a problem here. And I don't know. I don't deal with it in my own yard, luckily for me, but I think that yes, it would work, but you need a little bit more time than you would need to set back like traditional Kentucky bluegrass. That doesn't, or like if you're smothering a typical lawn, that doesn't take quite as long. One thing to consider is like smothering it, and then when you think maybe it's dead, like scratching it up and kind of reinvigorating it, see if it sprouts back up again, and then smother it again. One product is like the iron chelate, which is not an herbicide, but it is something that you can apply in the springtime to kill creeping Charlie. And it is a recommendation I've read about, but I haven't actually done myself, but I am going to do it. I'm going to try it this spring. So that's something I'm interested in learning a lot more about and how that works. But just by learning about it, it seems to make sense how it works. But from the smothering technique, another option is, it depends on what it's growing in. If it's creeping Charlie in a lawn, you could try out competing by introducing fine fescues. Like I mentioned, that component of the bee lawn that does so well in dry soils. It also actually does really well in shady soils, and it's a great like turf alternative in shaded backyards if you did want something that was a little bit more like a turf grass type where you're able to use the space. That fine fescue, and that I have heard good things about coexisting or maybe even out competing creeping Charlie. So that didn't answer the question great, but I don't have any better explanation than that.
Quite all right. Let's see here. We'll just do a couple more, and then I think there's a few that are a little bit more in depth where I think it would make a lot of sense for folks to reach out to you or to Minnesota Native Landscapes directly to explore the options.
Yeah. So I would say too, I put the email here as info@MNL Corp. I just put that I actually will answer that directly. So that if you email us on our general info, that will come to me. If you hop onto our website at all, a little chat box, if you reach us during the daytime hours, a little chat box will pop up. That's me also. If you call and say you have a question about native plants or seed, you're probably going to reach me. So any of those options work.
Great. So the product that you named when you were talking about battling the creeping Charlie, the person had asked if you could type that into the chat function or the Q&A function just for reference so they could look into that.
Yes, I will try to do that.
Do you in the Zoom function at the bottom, a little bar should pop up. If there's the chat function, you can certainly put it there if you can see that.
I only see Q&A and I can only just read everybody's questions.
If you scroll down to the bottom of the Q&A, that last question, that's where,
there we go.
Yep,
okay.
And you can just type in the answer. That would be fine. Just click type answer, and then there'll be an option to send it directly to that person. No, that's a great question. And it's just, there are so many layers and, you know, certain nuances to the approach for working towards incorporating more native plants into our green spaces that we share with birds and other wildlife. And we're really grateful for this opportunity to learn a little bit more and to understand kind of what some of our opportunities are for next steps. And I can certainly speak from experience that Minnesota Native Landscapes has been incredible to work with over the past. And in my time working with Audubon, Minnesota, it was a lot of fun working on discussion around that, the bird specific, the seed mix, and just seeing what was being developed, really speaking to what people are excited about and what's going to work well within this landscape. I think for the rest of the questions, now that we have Bre's contact information with Minnesota Native Landscapes on the screen, go ahead and jot that down. We've recorded this session, so we will be posting it to YouTube and to our other social media avenues, so you can rewatch it. I know it's a lot of information to take in, and making notes along the way as far as what you'd like to do and more questions that come up later. It's a great way to kind of work through that, and this is the ideal time of year, I think, to start thinking about spring and thinking about what you'd like to start working on, what kind of project. And Bre and her team are just excellent resources. I think in closing here, in terms of resources that folks had, you had a really great list that you spotlighted, I think, on the Plants for Birds National Audubon Society webpage. If someone happens to live in a geography where they don't have direct access to let's say a nursery that is on that list, tell us just maybe two or three questions that they could be prepared with going into a nursery that isn't on that list. Let's say if it's their local garden center, whatever it is, what are the things that they need to know when trying to select plants that might be advertised as native, or what are the things that they need to know?
So the one that I think people have heard a lot about over the past few years is, asking if plants are neonicotinoid free. That's gonna, indicate if plants are free of neonics, that means that they are going to be more beneficial to, or maybe less harmful to insects. So we'll just say less harmful to insects. And then, that coincides being less harmful to birds that are consuming insects. So that's a great question to ask. Check the tags. And I think that that's becoming more well-known and ideally also less used practice. Another thing you can ask is if the county of origin is known. So, or county or state, or so see if you can find out any origin information about the plants, for where they came from, where the seed came from. Native seed and plants, it should all be tracked. So if they are actually native to Minnesota, it's like the actual local origin, you could always try asking. Another would be, selecting plants that are that don't have complex names. So that would be something that's unchanged from its original form. For example, not choosing something that's double blooming, that's never going to be a native. If it's something that's called double blooming, or if it has a different fancy name, for example, like turtle head is a native kind of moist soil plant, and in the native form, it's kind of like a creamy white color flower. But then like a popular cultivar you see it like a lot in rain gardens is like hot lips. And so you're never going to see a native plant that's called hot lips. So it's usually going to be a cultivar, which means it's, probably still a great plant, but maybe not providing all of the same benefits as the local origin plants would.
Great. And then just in closing, so we've certainly talked about plenty of local sort of geographical, focusing on Minnesota, but for our friends that are joining us from outside of Minnesota and perhaps outside of this region, there is, of course, a good, kind of starting point with the Audubon Plants for Birds search engine. Are there any other kind of resources or kind of first steps that you can think of? I know that you mentioned, for instance, reaching out to your local watershed district, and that might be a great place to start if you're outside of the state of Minnesota, or specifically this area.
Yeah, so checking on your local level. I didn't zoom down far enough, and I'll do a quick new share here so I can show you, but back to the Audubon website, when you scroll down on the native plant nurseries, and here's our Minnesota ones again, and then below that was the online retailers, and that's just online only, but then below it is native plant nurseries around the country, and you can see this is like, even when I came across this list, I was surprised because I often get calls from some of these other states, and they say, oh, there's nobody here that does like what you do. But maybe there is on maybe just a different scale. So this is a good resource, but other ideas would just be, if it's not within this habitat group, there are other gardening, like in Minnesota, for example, we have the extension, right? So like those opportunities through the U of M extension or master gardeners, and they're starting to do a lot of initiatives, learning a lot more about native plants and things, and having some of those programs. But then out of Minnesota, other states and colleges and universities have a lot of information about very similar topics. If it's not native restoration, then it's maybe like sustainable agriculture or something like that. And so some of these concepts kind of go hand in hand. So reaching out to higher education or community education type programs is a good place to start.
Great. And I see that one of our chapter leaders, Connie, in the chat function did provide a link to a Facebook page that is Minnesota Audubon Chapters Planting for Birds. So that would be another great resource. We'll make sure that even after this program has ended and we get the recording up, that we will share that link again on our Audubon Chapter of Minneapolis Facebook page, so you can see it there as well. All right, Bre, thank you so much. There's a lot of compliments coming in through the chat function, and people really appreciative of everything that you've shared with us here tonight. I think this is a great point of inspiration for people to get started and start dreaming about spring and the growing season and getting things going. So thank you so much for bringing this to us tonight.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was fun. I enjoy talking about more than pollinators, and I think that every bird and other critter has a lot to say about things that we can do in our own backyards for increasing habitat. So.
Absolutely. No, there's, it was, like I said, a full house, and I think a lot of excitement and kind of getting going. So hopefully there will be lots of reports from everyone and people sharing what they have done once we get into the growing season. Have a great night, everyone. And again, you know how to contact the Audubon chapter of Minneapolis if you'd like to stay in touch on future programs that we have and opportunities to get involved. And of course, you have the contact information for Minnesota Native Landscapes and our speaker, Bre. Thank you, everyone, and have a great night.